The fog came down off the iron-spine peaks like something alive, swallowing the ridgeline where Dura Stormbound's kin had died only hours before, and she ran through it with her sword arm hanging useless at her side and her own blood freezing in the creases of her leather vest. She could not see her hand in front of her face. She could not hear anything but her own ragged breath and the distant, wet crunch of boots that were not her own, somewhere behind her in the white murk, closing the distance a little more with every heartbeat. Cragmer's warriors had painted their faces with human blood and worn stolen human cloaks over their armor when they fell upon the treaty envoys at Thornbrook Pass, and in the chaos and the screaming she had not understood, not truly understood, until she saw her own chieftain's throat opened by an axe that belonged to her own clan, that the slaughter had never been meant to look like anything other than a human betrayal. She was the only one left. She did not know that for certain, but she felt it in the marrow of her bones, the terrible hollow certainty of a woman who has watched every face she loved go still in the snow. Her lungs burned. The fog thickened, pressing cold and wet against her skin, disorienting her, robbing her of the one thing a storm-bound warrior was never supposed to lose, her direction. She did not know if she ran toward the human outpost or away from it. She did not know if the boots behind her belonged to Cragmer's warband or to her own dead friends' ghosts. The world had become nothing but white and gray and the copper taste of her own fear. And then, cutting through all of it, low and warm and utterly unafraid, came a man's voice. It was not shouting. It was not raised in alarm or challenge. It was simply singing, some old work song about a river and a wheel and a woman waiting home, off-key and unhurried, the voice of someone who believed himself entirely alone in the night and did not care who heard him hum badly to himself while he worked. Dura stopped running. She stood in the fog with her chest heaving, blood dripping black in the moonless dark, and she listened to that voice the way a drowning woman listens to a shoreline she cannot see but knows must be there. It did not sound like a threat. It did not sound like a trap. It sounded absurdly, wonderfully like a man entirely unbothered by war, entirely unbothered by fog or blood or broken truces, simply working late by lantern light and singing to keep himself company. She turned toward it. She had no other choice left to trust. The ground was uneven beneath her boots, roots and stones hidden under drifted snow, and twice she stumbled, catching herself on her good arm, biting back the sound that wanted to tear out of her throat every time her wounded shoulder jarred. The voice grew nearer. She could make out words now, something about a miller's daughter, and beneath the words, a steady rhythmic sound, wood against wood, a mallet driving a peg home, the unmistakable noise of a man building something with his hands in the dead of night. She broke through the last curtain of fog, and there he was. A lean, broad-shouldered human stood in a pool of lantern light beside a half-raised timber frame, his sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, sweat and sawdust clinging to his forearms, a mallet in one hand and 3 iron nails held loose between the fingers of the other. He was singing to a half-finished mill wheel as though it could hear him, as though the fog and the night and the whole frozen world were nothing more than an audience for a song only he knew the words to. He heard her before he saw her. His voice cut off mid-note. He turned, mallet lifting instinctively, and the lantern light spilled across his face, plain and weathered and utterly without cruelty, and across Dura, swaying on her feet, one arm hanging wrong, orcish leathers slick with her own blood, tusks bared not in threat but in exhaustion in the last raw effort of staying upright. For one endless second neither of them moved. Then Dura Stormbound's knees gave out, and Gideon Lockhart dropped his mallet and caught her before she hit the ground. He did not shout for the watch. That was the first thing she would remember clearly, later, once the fever broke and the world stopped tilting. He did not scream for the outpost guard, did not reach for a weapon, did not do any of the things a sensible, frightened man should have done upon finding a wounded orc warrior collapsing into his arms in the black heart of the night. He simply lowered her to the ground with a care that seemed to cost him nothing, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat to feel for a pulse, and muttered, "All right. All right, you are all right, just breathe," in a voice gone low and steady, the same voice that had called her through the fog. "Human," she managed, her own voice a wrecked whisper, her hand closing weakly around his wrist, not to push him away but because some ancient, animal part of her needed to know he was real. "Do not call the watch." "I was not planning to," he said. "I was planning to keep you from bleeding out on my mill floor if that is agreeable to you." Despite everything, despite the blood and the fog and the dead behind her, something in Dura's chest that had been clenched tight since Thornbrook Pass loosened, just slightly, at the dry, steady humor in his words. "It is agreeable," she said, and let the darkness take her. Gideon Lockhart had built half of Frostgate Hollow with his own 2 hands, though the town would sooner have credited a passing wind for the church roof than admitted a quiet millwright deserved the thanks. He had raised the granary. He had reset the crooked timbers of the old watchtower after the spring flood nearly took it into the river. He built things that were meant to last, joints fitted so tight they needed no nails at all, and he did it mostly alone, mostly at night, because during the day there were always eyes on him, weighing him, finding him wanting in some way he had never quite been able to name. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and the town had long ago decided there was something faintly sad about that. The way a man who built things so well should not know how to build a life alongside anyone else. He did not mind it, mostly. He had his tools and his timber and the mill he was raising by the river, meant to grind grain for the whole outpost once the ice broke in spring, and some nights that felt like enough. He had not expected an orc woman to fall out of the fog and into his life. He dragged her inside his workshop, a long, low building of raw pine that smelled of resin and wood smoke, and laid her on the wide bench where he usually planed boards, and by lantern light, he cut away the shoulder of her leather vest to find the wound beneath. A spear thrust, deep and ugly, that had gone through muscle without striking anything a body could not live without, if it was tended quickly and cleanly. His hands did not shake. He had set his own broken fingers once, alone, with a strip of leather clenched between his teeth, and he had learned in the years since that fear was a luxury, a man building things alone in the wilderness could not always afford. He boiled water. He found the clean linen he kept for his own cuts and splinters. He packed the wound with crushed yarrow from the jar his mother had left him before she died, years ago now, and bound it tight. And through all of it the orc woman did not wake, though twice she moaned something in her own tongue, low and mournful, a sound that made the hair on his arms rise, because he had never in his life heard an orc make a sound that was not a war cry or a curse, and this was neither. This was grief. He sat beside her through the rest of that long fog-bound night, a hammer within reach on the bench beside him, not because he thought he would need it, but because some habits were hard to unlearn even for a man inclined toward kindness. Outside, the fog pressed against the shuttered windows like something with weight, and twice, he thought he heard voices carried strangely on the wind, harsh guttural syllables that might have been orcish, might have been nothing at all, and each time he went still and listened until the sound faded and did not return. By the time gray dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, the fever in her had broken and her breathing had evened, and Gideon allowed himself, for the first time since he had caught her falling body in his arms, to truly look at her. She was, he thought, the most striking creature he had ever seen, and it embarrassed him a little to think it, given the circumstances, but it was true, and he had never been a man who lied to himself for comfort. Her skin was a deep mossy green, weathered by wind and sun, marked along one forearm with old pale scars that spoke of a life lived by the edge of a blade. Her black hair, even matted with blood and sweat, held a heavy dark shine, and it was cropped shorter on one side, longer on the other, in some fashion he did not recognize but suspected meant something to her people. She wore fitted leathers, A warrior's traveling gear, dark hide dyed and stitched close to her body, plated at the shoulders with hammered iron scales that had done little to stop the spear that found her. Even wounded, even unconscious, there was a coiled strength in her that the workshop's dim light could not disguise, powerful shoulders, a lean muscled frame built for speed as much as force, tusks that curved neat and white from her lower jaw. She looked, Gideon thought, like something out of the old war ballads his father used to sing before the last truce, before peace had made those songs feel foolish and far away. She looked like a woman who had never once in her life needed anyone's help. And yet here she was, in his workshop, alive because he had happened to be singing badly to a half-built mill wheel in the fog. She woke near midday with a knife already in her hand. Gideon did not know where she had gotten it, whether she had kept it hidden through the whole ordeal or plucked it from his own bench of tools while he dozed in the chair beside her. But one moment she was still and the next her eyes were open, gold-brown and sharp, and the point of a blade was pressed just beneath his jaw, and he had gone very carefully, very deliberately still. "Where?" she said, her voice a low rasp. "My workshop," Gideon said, as evenly as he could manage with a knife at his throat. "Outside Frostgate Hollow. You collapsed in the fog last night. I brought you in and tended your wound. I would very much appreciate it if you did not open my throat as a thank you." Her eyes flicked around the room, cataloging, he suspected, every possible exit and every possible weapon before returning to his face. "You are alone." "I am." "You did not call your watch." "I did not." "Why?" It was, Gideon reflected later, a fair question, and one he did not entirely have a good answer to even now. "You were dying," he said simply. "I did not much feel like letting that happen on my floor when it was in my power to stop it. Whatever quarrel brought you here was not mine to punish you for while you slept." The knife did not move for a long moment. Then slowly she withdrew it, though she did not let go of it, and pushed herself up onto one elbow, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitched shoulder. "You are either a very foolish man," she said, "or a very rare one. I have been told both, usually by the same people." Something that was almost a laugh escaped her, quickly swallowed, as though she had not expected to make such a sound and resented having done it. She studied him with new interest then, the wary calculation in her gaze shifting into something more searching. "You are not afraid of me." "I am something afraid of you," Gideon admitted. "You did have a knife at my throat a moment ago. But I built that mill wheel out there timber by timber with my own hands over the better part of a year, and I have learned that most things worth having require you to work through being afraid of them first." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face, some of the raw edge of animal wariness, eased just slightly. "I am Dura Stormbound," she said, "of the Stormbound clan sworn to the Treaty of Thornbrook, or I was. I do not know what I am now. My chieftain is dead. My kin are dead. I do not know if the truce itself still breathes." Gideon's chest tightened. Frostgate Hollow's council had spoken of little else for the past year but the treaty at Thornbrook Pass, the fragile peace hammered out after 2 generations of border war, the first uneasy handshake between Orc clan and human outpost in living memory. If it had broken, if blood had been spilled at the pass itself, then the quiet life he had been building timber by timber was about to be swallowed by something far larger and far more dangerous than a fog. "Tell me what happened," he said. And so, haltingly at first, then in a flood she seemed almost unable to stop once it started, Dura told him. The envoys meeting at Thornbrook passed to renew the treaty for another year. The ambush in the fog, warriors wearing stolen human cloaks smeared with blood to make the slaughter look like betrayal from the outpost side. Her chieftain's throat opened by a blade she recognized, an axe belonging to her own clan, wielded by a warrior she had trained beside since girlhood. Cragmer, a rival chieftain long hungry for war, long resentful of the peace that kept his warbands' raids in check, orchestrating a massacre meant to look like human treachery, so that the clans would rise as one and drown the border in blood again. "He will tell his warriors that humans slaughtered the envoys," Dura said, her jaw tight, her hands curled into fists on the blanket Gideon had laid over her. "He will tell my clan that I fled like a coward and abandoned my chieftain to die, if he believes I still live at all. Either way, in a matter of days, perhaps less, there will be war along this whole border again, and Frostgate Hollow will burn first, because it sits closest to the pass." Gideon sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. "Then we need to tell someone. The council. Someone who can send word up the border, warn the other outposts, buy time." "They will not believe an orc," Dura said flatly. "Least of all one found bleeding in a human's workshop with no proof but her own word. They might believe me." She looked at him then, really looked as though reassessing something. "Why would you help me? I am nothing to your people. Less than nothing if Cragmer's lie takes root before the truth does." Gideon considered the question seriously, the way he considered the grain of a plank before he cut it, looking for where it might split if pushed wrong. "Because I have spent most of my life building things I hoped would last," he said finally. "A mill, a watchtower, a granary roof that would not leak. I do not much care for watching something as fragile and hard won as that truce get torn down by a liar's knife in the fog, not while I have breath left to say otherwise. And," he added quieter, "because you followed my voice through that fog instead of anyone else's, and I find I would rather not have that count for nothing." Something shifted in Dura's face, something wary and old and long-guarded loosening by the smallest fraction, though she covered it quickly by looking away toward the shuttered window. "That is a foolish reason to risk your life," she said. "Probably," Gideon agreed. "I have never claimed to be a wise man, only a stubborn one." The trouble, as Gideon had known it would be, started the moment anyone in Frostgate Hollow laid eyes on her. He had hoped to keep her hidden a few more days, long enough for her wound to close properly, long enough to plan how best to bring word of Cragmer's treachery to the outpost council, without a mob forming before the truth could be spoken. But an orc warrior, even a wounded one confined to a workshop bench, was not an easy thing to keep secret in a town of 400 souls, where every window faced every other window and gossip traveled faster than fire in dry grass. It was old Hedda Vance, come to collect the axe-handle Gideon had promised to mend for her, who found the door barred against her for the first time in 3 years of neighborly visits, and who peered through the gap in the shutters out of simple nosiness, and who saw, unmistakably, a green-skinned figure lying on the workshop bench within. By the following afternoon, half the town had gathered outside Gideon's workshop with axes, pitchforks, and one very old, very rusted musket that belonged to the outpost's aging militia captain, a man named Osric Vane who had fought in the last war and never quite stopped fighting it in his own mind. Gideon stood in his own doorway, blocking it with his body, a mallet in one hand because it was the only tool close enough to reach and because he had refused, when Dura pressed it into his palm, to take her own knife instead. "Stand aside, Lockhart," Osric Vane said, leveling the old musket, more for show than any real intent to fire, Gideon suspected, though he did not care to test that theory. "You are harboring an enemy of this town. The treaty is broken. Word came down from the pass rider not 2 hours ago. Orcs slaughtered our envoys in the fog." "Orcs did not slaughter your envoys," Gideon said, his voice steady though his heart hammered against his ribs. "A traitor named Cragmer did, wearing stolen cloaks to make it look like human treachery, so that his own clan would rise for war. The woman inside my workshop is the only survivor of that ambush, and the only proof left alive that the truce was broken by his hand, not any humans, and not the Stormbound clans either." A ripple of uncertain muttering passed through the crowd. Gideon saw faces he had known for years, faces belonging to men whose barns he had raised, whose children's cradles he had built, and he saw in most of them not hatred exactly, but a deep, old fear dressed up as certainty, the kind of fear that made men reach for muskets and pitchforks before they reached for questions. "That is orc lies fed to a soft-headed carpenter," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Bring her out, Lockhart, or we will burn that workshop down around the both of you." It was then that the workshop door opened behind Gideon, and Dura Stormbound stepped out into the pale afternoon light, moving slowly, favoring her wounded shoulder but standing tall despite it, her chin lifted, her gold-brown eyes sweeping the crowd without a flicker of fear in them. A gasp went through the gathered townsfolk. Several men lifted their weapons higher. Osric Vane's musket swung toward her, and Gideon's whole body moved before his mind had finished deciding to, stepping directly into the space between the musket's barrel and Dura's chest. "You will have to go through me first, Osric," Gideon said, and he was surprised by how calm his own voice sounded, when inside him everything was roaring. "I have known you 11 years. I built the cradle your granddaughter sleeps in. I am asking you as a neighbor to lower that musket and let this woman speak before you decide what she is." For a long, terrible moment, nobody moved. The fog that had never quite lifted that whole gray day curled thin and low around the crowd's boots, and somewhere a dog barked, and Gideon stood with his heart in his throat, waiting to find out whether 11 years of raised barns and mended fences counted for anything at all against fear. Then Dura's voice rang out, clear and carrying, pitched to reach every ear in that crowd. "I am Dura Stormbound, daughter of the Stormbound clan," she said. "I watched Cragmore of the Ashfang line drive an axe through my own chieftain's throat at Thornbrook Pass, wearing a stolen human cloak so the blame would fall on your people instead of his. I have no reason to lie to you. My chieftain is dead. My kin are dead. I have nothing left to gain by protecting your outpost, and everything to lose by staying here at all. And yet I am standing in front of you unarmed because this man believed the truth was worth the risk of his own life to defend, and I will not let that be for nothing." The silence that followed was different from the one before it, heavier, considering. It was Osric Vane, finally, who lowered the musket, his weathered face creased with an old soldier's reluctant, hard-won caution. "If you are lying to us, Orc," he said, "there will be nowhere on this border you can run that we will not find you." "If I am lying," Dura said evenly, "you may kill me yourself, Captain, and I will not raise a hand to stop you." It was not trust, not yet, not from most of them. But it was enough, that day, to keep the axes lowered and the workshop standing, and Gideon Lockhart let out a breath he felt he had been holding since the moment the crowd first gathered. And beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his, Dura Stormbound did the same. The council met that night in the long hall above the trading post, lantern light flickering over worried faces, and it was decided, after much argument, that riders would be sent along the border to warn the other outposts of Cragmore's treachery, and that Dura Stormbound would remain, under Gideon Lockhart's charge and responsibility, until her word could be tested against whatever news came back from the pass. It was not friendship. It was not even trust, but it was a door left open, however narrowly, and Gideon walked Dura back to his workshop through the last curling remnants of fog with something in his chest that felt, absurdly, like hope. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm neither of them had expected. Dura's wound healed clean under the yarrow poultices and the willow bark tea Gideon brewed each morning, and as her strength returned, so did the restless energy of a warrior unaccustomed to stillness. She took to helping him in the workshop, at first simply to occupy her hands, hauling timber he could not lift alone, holding boards steady while he cut, and Gideon found with some surprise that she had a quick eye for the work, an instinct for where a joint needed to bear weight and where it could be left light, the kind of understanding that came from a life spent building and rebuilding a warbands camp season after season, hide tents and timber palisades raised and struck down and raised again. "You are strong," he told her one gray afternoon, watching her set a heavy beam into place with one arm as though it weighed nothing at all, her wounded shoulder healed enough now to bear the strain. "Stronger than any 3 men I have hired for this work. Orc women are not raised to be delicate," Dura said, not without pride. "We are raised to survive winters that kill weaker things. We are raised to fight beside our warband, not behind it." She glanced sideways at him, a considering look he was coming to recognize. Your people seem to prefer their women soft, fragile. I have seen how the town women look at me, like I am something that should not exist. Some of them think that, Gideon admitted, because he had never seen the use in lying to her. Most of them are simply frightened of what they do not understand. I do not think you are something that should not exist, Dura. I think you might be the most remarkable thing I have ever built anything beside. She went very still at that, and for a moment Gideon feared he had overstepped some line he had not known was there, but then a slow smile curved across her tusked mouth, sharp and pleased. That is a strange compliment, millwright, but I think I like it. It became, over the following weeks, a habit between them, this careful trading of honesty, small confessions offered up like gifts across the workbench while sawdust drifted golden in the lantern light. She told him of the stormbound clans hunting grounds in the high passes, of the songs her mother used to sing while braiding war charms into her hair, of the particular grief of watching a chieftain she had loved like a second father cut down by a blade that should have stood beside him instead. He told her of his own mother, dead of a winter fever when he was 19, of his father who had taught him to read wood grain before he could properly read letters, of the long solitary years since, building things for a town that respected his work and mostly forgot his face. They do not see you, Dura said one evening, sitting close beside him on the workshop bench as he sanded a length of oak by lamplight, her voice low with something that sounded almost like anger on his behalf. You raised half the buildings in that town with your own hands, and they walk past you as though you are furniture. I do not understand your people at all. It is not so bad, Gideon said, though something in his chest warmed painfully at the fierce protectiveness in her tone. I have never much minded quiet. I would mind it, Dura said. If I loved someone, I would not let the whole world walk past them unseen. The word love hung in the air between them unclaimed, and Gideon felt his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He turned to look at her, close enough now that he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes catching the lamplight, close enough to smell the wood smoke and leather scent of her skin. Dura, he said low. I have decided something, Gideon Lockhart, she said. Before he could finish whatever he had been about to say, her voice suddenly rough, and there was nothing hesitant in the way she reached out and closed her hand around the front of his shirt, drawing him toward her with a strength that could have crushed stone and chose, instead, to be gentle. I have decided I am tired of pretending I do not want to do this. And then her mouth found his, fierce and certain, tasting faintly of the mint tea she favored, and Gideon Lockhart, who had spent 11 quiet years building things alone in the dark, forgot entirely how to breathe. When she finally drew back, just far enough to look at him, there was a fire in her gold-brown eyes that had nothing to do with anger. You did not stop me, she said, half challenge, half wonder. I did not want to, Gideon admitted, his voice unsteady in a way that embarrassed him not at all. I have wanted to do that since you had a knife at my throat, if I am honest, which frankly says something troubling about my judgment. Dura laughed, a real laugh this time, warm and unguarded, and the sound of it did something to Gideon's chest that felt very much like a wall he had not known he was carrying finally coming down. Good judgment is overrated, she said, and kissed him again. News from the border came 10 days later, carried by a lathered horse and a rider gray with exhaustion, and it was not good. Cragmore had not waited for confusion to settle in his favor. He had moved fast, gathering the scattered warbands loyal to the Ashfang line, spreading his lie of human treachery at Thornbrook Pass to any clan willing to listen. And now, with the fog season deepening the long winter nights across the northern passes, he was marching a warband toward Frostgate Hollow itself, close to 200 strong, to make the outpost pay for a massacre it had never committed. The council hall that night was loud with fear. Gideon stood near the back, Dura at his side, and watched grown men who had lived their whole lives believing the border truce would argue themselves hoarse over how many days they had before Cragmore's warband reached the palisade. and whether the outpost's thin militia stood any chance at all against 200 trained warriors. "We cannot fight them," Osric Vane said grimly, his old soldier's face lined with the particular exhaustion of a man who remembered exactly what the last war had cost. "We have 40 men who can hold a spear steady, and half of those are farmers who have never swung one in anger. If Cragmore reaches these walls, Frostgate Hollow burns." It was Dura who spoke into the silence that followed, her voice cutting through the fear the same way it had once cut through the fog, calm and certain. "Cragmore's claim to lead the clans rests entirely on the lie he told at Thornbrook Pass," she said. "If that lie is broken in front of witnesses from both sides, human and orc together, his warband will not follow him into a war built on a truth he cannot survive being exposed for. Orc clans do not follow chieftains who murder their own to seize power. They follow strength, yes, but they follow honor more, and a chieftain proven to have broken both will find his own warriors turn on him faster than any human blade could manage." "And how," Osric Vane demanded, "do you propose we expose him when he commands 200 spears and we have 40? "By orc law," Dura said, "any warrior may challenge a chieftain's claim through trial by combat before witnesses if they carry proof of his dishonor. I carry that proof. I watched him kill my chieftain with my own eyes, and I bear the wound his warriors gave me at Thornbrook Pass to prove I was there. If I challenge him before his own warband and this outpost together and win, his claim dies with him, and there will be no war left to fight." The hall erupted into argument at that, half the council insisting it was madness to trust an orc's word for a plan that put the whole town's fate on a single duel, the other half, led reluctantly by Osric Vane, pointing out they had no better options at all. Gideon caught Dura's arm as the argument raged around them, his voice low and urgent, meant only for her. "You cannot mean to fight him alone. He has 200 warriors at his back and you have barely finished healing." "I mean exactly that," Dura said, and there was no fear in her face, only a hard, clear resolve that frightened Gideon more than any monster in the fog ever could. "It is the only way, Gideon. If I do not challenge him, this whole valley burns, your outpost and my clan both, and everyone in it, you included. I will not let that happen while I have breath and a blade left to stop it. Then let me stand with you. You are not a warrior. I am a stubborn man who has already told you I would rather work through being afraid of something than let it go unopposed," Gideon said, gripping her hands in both of his voice rough with everything he had not yet found the words to say plainly. "I cannot fight beside you, Dura. I know that. But I will not let you walk out to face him alone, as though I am not standing right here beside you every step of the way until it is done." Something fierce and tender moved across Dura's face at that, and she raised one hand to cup his jaw, her thumb brushing rough along his cheekbone. "Then stand where I can see you," she said quietly. "That will be enough. That has always been enough from the very first night in the fog." The morning Cragmore's warband reached the fields outside Frostgate Hollow. The sky hung low and gray, threatening snow, and the whole outpost turned out along the palisade to watch 200 orc warriors assemble in ranks on the frost-hardened ground beyond the gate, spears and axes bristling, war drums beating a slow, ominous rhythm that Gideon felt in his chest like a second heartbeat. Cragmore himself rode forward on a great tusked war-horse, a mountain of a warrior wrapped in plaited leather and wolf fur, his face marked with old battle scars and fresh contempt, and behind him, unmistakable even at this distance, hung the stolen human cloaks his warriors had worn at Thornbrook Pass, displayed now like trophies meant to prove a lie. Dura Stormbound walked out to meet him alone, dressed in her fitted warrior's leathers, her dark hair bound back, a borrowed sword at her hip that Gideon himself had spent the last 3 nights fitting a proper grip to by lamplight, shaping the wood and leather to her hand with the same care. He gave every joint meant to bear real weight. Gideon stood at the gate with the rest of Frostgate Hollow, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might crack a rib, and watched the woman he loved walk out alone across frozen ground to challenge a warlord in front of 400 townsfolk and 200 warriors, all of them silent, all of them watching, waiting to see whether the whole border would drown in blood or find, against every hard-won cynicism, a reason to believe peace was still possible. "Cragmore of the Ashfang line," Dura called out, her voice ringing clear across the frozen field. "I name you liar and murderer before your own warband and these human witnesses both. I watched you drive your axe through Chieftain Vrager's throat at Thornbrook Pass, wearing a stolen human cloak to hide the blood of our own people on your hands. I claim the right of challenge by the oldest law of our clans. Face me, or stand exposed before every warrior at your back as a coward who murders his own kin and blames it on lies." A furious murmur rippled through the assembled warband, glances exchanged, old loyalties visibly shaken. Cragmore's face darkened with rage. "You are a deserter who fled the pass like a coward," he roared back. "And now you crawl out of a human's bed to spread lies against your betters, Dura Stormbound. I will enjoy silencing you before your human lover's eyes." He dismounted, drawing a massive war axe from his back, its head notched from long use, and the warband began to close into a rough circle around the open ground, both human and orc pressing close along the frost-rimed grass to watch what would be, by any law either people understood, a fight to the death. Gideon's hands curled into fists at his sides as he watched Dura draw her sword and settle into a fighting stance, and every instinct in him screamed to run to her side, to do something, anything, and it took every ounce of will he had to remember her words, to stand where she could see him, and trust that this was the only kind of help she needed from him now. The two combatants circled once, twice, testing distance, and then Cragmore surged forward with a bellow, his war axe carving a brutal arc meant to end the fight in a single stroke. Dura was not there when it landed. She had moved with a speed that seemed impossible for someone still healing from a spear wound not 3 weeks old, dropping low and rolling beneath the axe's swing, coming up inside Cragmore's reach with her sword flashing in a strike he barely twisted away from in time, a thin line of green blood welling along his ribs. The crowd roared, both sides forgetting for a moment which outcome they were meant to be hoping for, caught entirely in the raw drama unfolding before them. Cragmore recovered fast, driving forward with the brute strength his size afforded him, forcing Dura back step by step, his axe crashing against her blade hard enough that Gideon saw her arm shudder with the impact even from the gate. She was strong, faster than Cragmore, but he was heavier, and every exchange left her breathing harder, favoring just slightly the shoulder that had not been whole a month before. "Come now," Cragmore sneered, circling her, forcing her to keep turning, keep tiring. "Even your human's carpentry cannot rebuild what I am about to break." He drove in again, a feinted low strike that became a brutal overhead swing at the last instant, and this time Dura was not quite fast enough, her block absorbing most of the force but not all of it, the flat of the axe catching her along the temple and sending her sprawling hard into the frozen ground, her sword skittering from her grip across the frost. A horrified gasp went up from the crowd. Gideon's whole body lurched forward before he could stop it, and it was only Osric Vane's hand catching his arm, hard and urgent, that kept him from vaulting the palisade fence entirely. "You will get her killed," the old militia captain hissed. "This is her fight, Lockhart. Do not take that from her now." Dura lay stunned on the ground, blood trickling from a cut above her brow, and Cragmore advanced on her with slow, savage satisfaction, raising his war axe for the killing blow, and in that terrible, suspended second with the whole frozen field holding its breath, Gideon Lockhart did the only thing he could think to do. He shouted her name. "Dura." It cut across the frozen field the way his voice had once cut across the fog, unmistakable, anchoring, and something in her answered it before conscious thought could, some deep animal certainty that the sound belonged to safety, to warmth, to a reason worth surviving for. Her eyes snapped open. Her hand found the hilt of her fallen sword in the frost beside her, and as Cragmer's axe descended, she rolled hard to the side, came up on one knee with a speed that stole the breath from every watching throat, and drove her blade upward through the gap in his armor beneath his raised arm, straight into his heart. Cragmer's roar died in his throat. His axe fell from suddenly nerveless fingers, burying its head harmlessly in the frozen ground beside her. For one long, swaying moment he stood there, disbelief written plain across his scarred face, and then he collapsed, and did not rise again. Silence held the field for 3 full heartbeats. Then it broke, all at once, into chaos, orc warriors surging forward not in fury, but in something closer to relief, several dropping to one knee before Dura Stormbound, where she knelt in the frost above the body of the liar who had nearly dragged their whole clan into an unnecessary war. And from the human side of the field, ragged, disbelieving cheering, because whatever their fear of orcs had been an hour before, they had just watched a woman fight to the death to save their outpost from a war she had no obligation at all to spare them from. Gideon did not remember climbing over the palisade fence. He did not remember crossing the frozen field. He remembered only reaching her, dropping to his knees in the churned snow beside her, his hands framing her bloodied face with a desperation he made no effort to hide. "I am well," Dura said, though her voice was rough and her eyes were glassy with exhaustion and pain. "Gideon, I am well. Your voice found me again." "You are bleeding," he said, half laughing, half something closer to weeping, pressing his forehead to hers with a care that belied the tremor in his hands. "I bleed easily. It is one of my many charms." She caught his wrist, drawing his hand down to press flat over her heart, her gold-brown eyes fierce and clear despite everything. "I am not finished with you, millwright. Do not think one duel is enough to be rid of me. I would burn down every mill I have ever built before I let you go anywhere," Gideon said, and kissed her, right there in the churned frost, in front of 200 orc warriors and 400 humans, and this time no one in either crowd raised a weapon at all. The days that followed the duel unraveled Cragmer's brief, bloody claim to power entirely. The warriors who had followed him, stripped of the lie that had bound them, splintered into disarray, some returning north to their own hunting grounds, others, remarkably, remaining at the edge of Frostgate Hollow's fields to hear what remained of the Stormbound clan's word on the matter, since Dura, as the last surviving voice of her chieftain's line, found herself, whether she wished it or not, the closest thing left to authority the clan possessed. It was Dura who stood before both peoples 3 days later, at the same frozen field where Cragmer had fallen, and formally renewed the Treaty of Thornbrook Pass, her hand pressed flat against Osric veins in the old gesture of truce, her voice carrying clear and certain across the assembled crowd. "Let it be known," she said, "that the treaty stands not because either side has forgotten the wars before it, but because we have both now watched what a broken truce costs and found neither of us wishes to pay that price again." Osric Vane, gruff old soldier that he was, actually smiled at that, something Gideon had rarely seen him do. "Well said, Lady Stormbound," he said. "Frostgate Hollow will hold to it." It was late that same night, with the fires of celebration still burning low along the outpost's edges and the fog, for once, thin and harmless under a clear cold sky full of stars, that Dura found Gideon alone in his workshop, sanding the last rough edges from the mill wheel he had been building the night she first followed his voice through the dark. She stood in the doorway a long moment, watching him work before she spoke. "You never finished your song," she said. "The one about the miller's daughter." Gideon looked up, startled into a smile. "I did not think anyone was listening that night." "I was listening," Dura said, crossing the workshop floor toward him, moving with none of the careful wariness she had carried the first night, only a warm, certain ease that had grown between them like new wood joined tight and true. "I have been listening to your voice ever since, millwright. I intend to keep doing so for a very long time." She reached up and drew from beneath her collar a small braided cord strung with a single carved wolf's tooth, an old thing, worn smooth, clearly precious. "This belonged to my mother," she said. "Among my people, a warrior gives this to the one she claims as hers, before her whole clan if she is proud of the choice, and I have never in my life been more proud of anything than I am to give this to you now." Gideon's throat closed. He had heard in the weeks since her arrival some scattered mention of orc courtship customs, of claiming and marking and bold, fearless choosing, but hearing of a thing and having it offered to him with such raw, open sincerity were entirely different experiences, and he found himself, for a rare moment, entirely without words. "Dura," he managed finally, "I am only a carpenter. I have nothing so fine to offer in return." "You built me a sword grip that fit my hand exactly," Dura said, fastening the cord around his neck with careful fingers, her gold-brown eyes bright in the lantern light. "You stood in front of a mob for me before you knew whether I deserved it. You shouted my name across a battlefield and pulled me back from death with nothing but the sound of your voice. I do not need finer than that, Gideon Lockhart. I have chosen you. Not because you rescued me from the fog, though you did, and not because you are the only man foolish enough to want me, though I suspect that is closer to true than either of us will admit. I have chosen you because in all my life, no one has ever made me feel more like myself than I do standing in this workshop beside you." Gideon reached up and closed his hand over the wolf's tooth resting warm against his chest, and then he reached further, cupping her face in both his rough, calloused hands, the same hands that had built half a town and set her wound and shaped a sword grip to fit her palm exactly. "Then I accept," he said, his voice thick. "Gladly. Completely. I have spent 11 years building things I hoped would last, Dura Stormbound, and I did not know until the night you fell out of the fog and into my arms that I had never once built anything as strong or as lasting as what I feel for you." She kissed him then, slow and deep. None of the fierce urgency of that first stolen kiss in the workshop, but something steadier beneath it. A promise settling into place the way a keystone settles into an arch, bearing weight that only makes the whole structure stronger for it. Winter deepened over Frostgate Hollow in the weeks that followed, but it was a gentler winter than any the outpost had known in years, the treaty holding firm, orc traders beginning, cautiously at first, then with growing ease, to bring furs and worked iron down through the passes to trade at the outpost market. Human farmers no longer flinching quite so violently at the sight of green skin among the stalls. Dura remained, dividing her time between what remained of her scattered clan, now slowly regathering under her uncertain but respected leadership, and Gideon's workshop by the river, where the mill wheel he had built the night they met finally turned for the first time on a bright, cold morning in early spring, grinding grain for the whole outpost exactly as he had always intended. They stood together at the riverbank to watch it turn, the wreckage of the old dam he had torn out to build the new mill still scattered along the bank, timber and stone left where the winter floods had shifted them. And Dura laughed, bright and unguarded, at the sight of Gideon standing knee-deep in mud, trying to dislodge one final stubborn timber from where it had wedged itself against the new foundation. "You look ridiculous, millwright," she called from the bank, arms crossed, clearly enjoying herself far too much. "You are welcome to help instead of laughing," Gideon called back, wrestling with the timber, mud splattering up his forearms. "I would rather watch." But she was already wading in beside him regardless, catching the timber's other end with easy strength, and hauling it free in a single motion that sent them both sprawling backward into the shallow mud with a graceless splash. And for a long moment they simply lay there in the wreckage of the old dam, soaked and filthy and laughing until it hurt, the mill wheel turning steady and true above them, grinding out the season's first grain, the fog long since burned away by a clean spring sun. "I have been thinking," Dura said, once the laughter had settled into something quieter, her head tipped against his shoulder, mud drying on both their skin, "that I would like to build something too. Something of my own alongside yours. Not a mill. I have no talent for wood." She turned her head to look at him, gold-brown eyes soft in the morning light. "But a life." Here at this river with this ridiculous, stubborn, singing carpenter who followed no voice through any fog at all, and yet still somehow found exactly the person he was meant to. "I think," Gideon said, drawing her closer despite the mud, despite everything, "that sounds like the finest thing I have ever been asked to build." The mill wheel turned above them, steady and sure, and the fog that had once separated them stayed gone. And on the riverbank, amid the broken timber of an old world torn down to make room for a new one, Dura Stormbound and Gideon Lockhart laughed together in the wreckage, and did not stop for a long, long time.